This film is called Experimental Landscapes in Watercolour. This reflects the title of my recent book on the same subject. I've stepped outside into my studio garden because I want to feel connected with nature while I'm indoor painting. In this film, I want you to forget about all those conventional chocolate box picture postcard versions of landscapes. I want to try and show you something a bit more personal and imaginative, and we can do that by experimenting with different ideas, playing around with paint, and trying out all sorts of ways of looking at the landscape in order to come up with something a bit more unusual. So come inside my studio and we'll get started on some work. Here I am in my lovely Cotswold studio. This is where I actually work most of the time when I'm not out collecting material to paint from. And before I start to paint, I just want to talk to you a little bit about how I go about collecting the information, because you cannot work in a vacuum. You cannot stand in a sterile studio and come up with ideas to paint the outdoors. You need to actually have been out there gathering that information. It's really important if you're painting the landscape to actually get out there and look at it, because only by looking at it and experiencing it, feeling it and smelling it, that you can really begin to understand what you're looking at and be able to interpret it back in the studio. So I tend to go out on lots of walks and I'll take a little sketchbook. Sometimes I'll do a quick pencil squiggle. It might just be the very smallest of scribbles, or sometimes I might develop it into a more detailed drawing if I've got more time. I'll also take my camera, take lots of photographs, but then I'll get back into my studio, put it all together, and then once I've had a good look at it, possibly even put it to one side and just work from my imagination. That way you get a much richer and more personal interpretation of what you've seen. I also, because my passion is for nature and the details within the landscape as much as the wider picture, I'll bring lots of that nature into my studio. So you'll always find big jugs of leaves and seed heads and all those sorts of details in pots all around my studio. And I would do that whatever the subject. If I was painting the beach, I would have shells and sand and things dotted around. For this picture this morning, I'm bringing a little bit of summer into my studio. I do like to paint what's in season generally, but for the film, I think it's important to show you some things at different times of the year. So I've taken one of my favourite subjects, which is a poppy field, and I'm showing you some ideas to do with that. Although this is a poppy field and you might sort of think that subject's been done to death, I'm trying to put in a slightly different interpretation to make it more interesting. And this is something that I actually saw through a kind of fringe of grasses and leaves and different structures in the foreground. So really, it's not about being a poppy field. It's about the patterns and the linear marks that the foreground material makes, with glimpses of red shining through. I kind of liken the finished effect a little bit to a stained glass window with those structural marks and separating all the individual colours. So before I start, I always play around with a variety of different colours and try out different techniques. And I've got some of my material and information that I want to show you here that I've put together. I've got some straight photographs of where I was, and also one or two little drawings and paint sketches. I've also got a piece where I've played around with colour and put cling film on in order to try and start getting the kind of patterns and textures that I'm looking for. I used an interpretation of this scene as the front cover for my recent book, Experimental Landscapes in Watercolour. And today I'm going to be doing a slightly different interpretation because I think you can paint the same subject over and over again in many different ways. So it'll be interesting for you to compare the two. I just want to tell you a little bit about my studio setup before we begin. And I've got a wide range of materials surrounding where I work so that I can pick and choose from them as I need them. Obviously, I've got lots of watercolours. That's the main medium that we're looking at here. They're in tubes. In general, I use Winsor & Newton or Daniel Smith because they both do fantastic colours, but I may use other brands as well if I see something I like. I also use inks and gouache, and we might be chucking in a bit of oil pastel, watercolour pencils, really anything that goes that can make the right mark that we need at the time. And I'll talk more about them as I'm going through the film. I also use quite a lot of different brushes. I have some lovely round brushes, and I'll have several on the go at the same time because I use a different brush to mix each different colour mix, so I'm not constantly having to change brushes all the time. And I've got some lovely flat brushes in all kinds of widths, and riggers as well. We'll be looking at riggers later on. I've got my board set out on the table, and I work at a slight tilt because that helps the paint to flow. I've got my paper ready for the start, and this particular one is Saunders Waterford, and it's £140 knot. And before you ask, no, I don't stretch my paper. I just leave it as it is because that gives you so much more flexibility, and I'll be showing you later on some of the ways in which that flexibility can be useful. What else? Lots of water. That does look a bit of a mucky jug, but actually it is very clean water, and I will be continually changing my water because that is so important with watercolour. We'll also be using things like cling film to create textures and a few other secret ingredients that will come later on in the film, and we'll talk about them when we get to them. So I'm excited to get started, and I'm going to begin by just playing around with a little bit of paint on paper, because even though I've been thinking very hard what colours I'm going to use, I still need to actually practice it before I begin. I'm really excited to get started, so enough of this chat and let's get down to doing some painting. Even though I have planned out my colours in theory, I still want to have a little play with them before I start. That is so important. So let's have a look at a few different options. Okay, I'm feeling slightly nervous of this white paper, and I just feel the need to put some paint on. Just try out these colours, like I said, and just try and relax a bit through the paint, at the same time as sort of working out, you know, which colours are going to work for me in this particular picture. And actually, by doing this, I'm actually physically loosening up, as well as sort of mentally loosening up. And once you've actually got that paint flowing, you kind of relax a bit and start feeling more in control of what you're doing. So let's just sort of have a bit of a play. And this isn't something that I'm doing because this is a film. This is what I do in every single painting that I do. It's really, really important, because if you want to create a loose effect, you have to be feeling relaxed within yourself. And it isn't just that, it's a little bit of planning, because this is quite an unstructured painting to start with. It's so I'm just moving the paint around, just having a little play before we begin. So this is all quite bright, trying to sort of get that stained glass window effect with this paler kind of sky effect. I think that, you know, this is going to be the kind of thing that I'm after. I had a blue watercolour pencil somewhere. I'm just going to try that out. Just get the idea of some of these grasses coming over, and can you see how it's actually dragging some of the paint through as well? And let's just have a little bit of a play with this one. Let's just put some cling film on. And we're going to repeat all this again in a minute on a bigger piece of paper, but it's always quite good to actually use your colour experiment as if it is going to be an actual painting. And sometimes, because you're doing it in this sort of very relaxed, you know, this is only an exercise kind of way, sometimes they end up being the ones that work best. Okay, I've made a beginning, got over that hurdle, so let's now move on to a bigger piece of paper and repeat some of those colours and techniques, but take it a little bit further. Before I actually get started on this, I just want to have a quick think about the composition. I'm not going to do lots of drawing because I want this to be quite spontaneous and free. But what I am going to do is just get into my head the basic structure. I want to have a smaller sky and a bigger foreground, because it's the foreground that's important. So I just need to bear that in mind when I put my main horizon line through. So I'm just sort of making a bit of a mark here, which is about a third, probably a little bit less. And also, when it comes to positioning the grasses and the main things that are in the front of the poppy field, I also want to make sure that they're not in the dead centre of the painting, that they're more towards one side. And again, sort of loosely thinking in terms of thirds to make it interesting. Right, so let's get this paint on now. I'm going to wet the paper a little bit before I get started, bearing in mind that the wetter the paper, you know, the more dilute the paint becomes. And I'm going to start at the top with some of this blue mixture. I've got cobalt blue in this and a little hint of cadmium red to warm things up. And leaving that at that. And then I'm going to move on to the reds, and I've got some Winsor red here, and I'm just going to move across the painting with that. I'm actually going to, changing brushes each time I change colour, I change brush, so I don't need to keep rinsing off that paint that's on the brush. I've just introduced a little bit of the quinacridine gold into a little bit of a sunlight feel, and just extend this down. I've got a lovely colour here called Perylene Scarlet. I think it's called, yes, Perylene Scarlet. It's a lovely autumny red. So I'm just moving around, and just letting things flow. Let's get this bigger brush. I like using these great big flat brushes because you can make big kind of chunky marks and stops you from getting too precious about things. It's just quite like the way that's drifting down, but I'll just re-establish that a little bit. And now we want to move on to some greens, and I've started to mix some French ultramarine with some quinacridine gold, and you can see that my brush is actually picking up some of the red that's already on there, and that kind of creates versions of colour. Amazing how it seems to be drying out. Keep things flowing. I'm actually just going to get my spray. I'm just going to spray this because things seem to be getting quite dry. And that will keep everything moving. It's nice to just let the paint find its own way down the page. I think the more you can get a painting to paint itself, quite often you get more interesting marks than if you've actually tried to be in control the whole time. Right, so I mean basically we've just done a wet into wet wash, which isn't all that exciting. So let's try and get a bit more texture into this by putting some cling film onto it. Perhaps first, before I do that, it might be a good idea to just get some of these kind of branchy, twiggy, grassy marks. Let's just sort of mess it all up a bit. Let's not be too frightened of it. That's some of that paint that's making its way down to the bottom. Go back into the painting. Actually, if you use your pencil slightly on its side, sometimes it actually scrapes the colour out, acts as a sort of scraping technique. I'm just going to introduce a few dark marks through here, which, you know, probably will get lost with the cling film and everything, but at least it'll get you know, the movement started. I've got a little drop of paint that's splashed its way on there, so let's just add a bit more colour and we can pretend that that was always meant to be. Lovely rigger brush, you can get nice, easygoing, flowing kind of lines. The other thing that I've forgotten about temporarily, is that I want to introduce at this stage the idea of some trees or hedgerow in the distance. So we've got a nice sort of pale colour. It's not as dark as the colour that comes through in the photograph, which actually makes it come forward. You have to remember that we're painting space, we're not just painting 2 dimensions. So that may well flow down and we might lose that horizon line, but we're not worrying about those details at the moment because we can change all that in the next stage. Right, I'm going to put my cling film on now. Not very happy with it at the moment. Not very interesting. So we're going to have to really try and mess it up a bit. One way of doing this would be to actually stretch the cling film out quite tightly so that it goes along where you actually want the poppy field to end. But then what I want is for the foreground to be much more kind of crumply. Actually, I don't think that works. With the cling film, you can manipulate it and move it. What's happening is that where the cling film doesn't touch the paper, you get a pale mark. Where it touches, you're getting the dark mark. And I'm getting marks here that I like, but I don't particularly like these ones. So the trouble is, the more you mess about, the more you kind of lose the freshness of the marks. I'm just going to have to put another little bit on here, on this side, so that that doesn't look kind of alien to everything else. So with this one, I'm going to sort of slightly crumple it to get more of the textures that I'm happy with. So that's that. I'm actually going to mix some green. And I'm actually going to paint it underneath the cling film. And what happens is, if you can see this, it starts to travel down the little, what I call the little pathways underneath the cling film to create. But can you see how it's finding these little pathways of cling film and it's disappearing underneath there, and almost immediately it's starting to get a lot more exciting. That's better, isn't it? It's all a little bit too clean, actually. I sort of feel as if I want to somehow dirty it up a little bit. I've just mixed some of that Perylene Scarlet with the blue to get a slightly more purple colour. Just see, I'm curling. You couldn't do this if you've got stretched paper. Curling that edge up. Got a bit more brown going in now. I'm sort of happier with a bit more brown. I might be really being silly here because this is kind of breaking the rules of watercolour by going into this area now where it might not actually be completely dry. But let's just sort of have a what the hell moment and start to establish some of this sort of hogweed that's in the background there. Just a little bit of splattering. It is actually quite dry, which is surprising. Just sort of drag it down. It's drier than I thought, so we may just have to put these on afterwards, after all. But let's get a little bit of paint on this, otherwise that blue sky is just going to be too scary to deal with later on. And all the time I'm thinking about these kind of triangle shapes that you get in between vegetation. Let's let that flow down. And I've flicked some. It's not be quite so precious over this. Actually, what I might do with that is just blot some little bits out. I might even just lightly touch it with the paper towel and blot some bits out, and get a bit of a crayon. Just draw into that. Just check what colour that is. Okay, maybe I just need to stop and think now, because quite a lot going on. Quite like the way you've got these pale marks here, but the dark marks there. And that's just completely abstract. But at the end of the day, I'm more interested in creating interesting abstract marks than in creating the absolute reality of the thing that it was that I saw. Okay, I need to leave this to dry now, which can take some time with the cling film on. It's important that you do leave it on until it is dry. If you take it off too early, the textures can disappear. So be patient. Using cling film can take a long time to dry, and in this case I've used a lot of cling film, so it has been taking several hours. If you try and take it off too soon, you lose the textures, so you have to be patient. And the other thing is that you never quite know what's going to happen as it's drying. Sometimes the cling film flattens onto the paper and kind of picks up the textures of the paper, which can be quite nice. Other times you lose some of the textures and things change around. You never quite know what's going to happen with this kind of experimenting. So in the meantime, I thought that I would try a slightly different version of the same painting using very similar techniques, but with a few little adjustments, so that I could choose between those two versions as to which way I was going to progress. So let's take a look at this second version now. So in this version, almost exactly the same colours and techniques were used, except I just decided to inject a little bit of extra colour, and I added some quinacridone magenta into this one. I also sprinkled salt into the background to get an impression of sort of distant trees, or maybe I might even convert those into some sort of cow parsley later on. Not quite sure at this stage. So the cling film's dry, I can take it off. So now we've taken the cling film off to reveal all these interesting and exciting textures that could represent stonework, or in this case, leafy foregrounds and just general kind of undergrowth. So let's have a look at the first version now that it's completely dry. And I've taken the cling film off. So I've had a look at both versions, and to sum up, I really think that the first one is the more exciting painting with more potential, so I'm going to go with that one. And I'm going to look now at some ways of cropping it to take it forward. So before I actually physically cut this, I'm going to just play around for a minute to decide which bits need to go. I don't like all this. And I think it works quite well as a square with this area here that's potentially going to be some foreground plant cropped at the top to give it a slightly more abstracty feel. So I'm going to crop it to a square and then start to work into it. I've trimmed the edges now, doing it quite carefully. I did it a little bit at a time so that I didn't cut off too much. And I have left a little bit of spare painting around the edges just in case. But whilst I was doing it, another thought occurred to me. So let's just have another quick look at the painting. So I suddenly realised that this area here, that is the bit that really interests me, might actually work quite well if I turn the whole thing round. If I do that, I'm going to have to recrop, take out the bottom bit, and then all this area here becomes a very prominent part of the painting, and I could work into this in a negative way, blocking out some of it, and make this into the plant life in front of the field. I've decided to go with the original version. Although I think that the idea of turning upside down is really exciting, I'm going to hold on to that thought for another experiment on another day. I don't want to come across as being indecisive. These decisions are all part of the creative process. And now I'm going to get on to the next stage. Right, I'm just going to look at some of these marks left by the cling film and see if I can just sort of take some of the marks down a little bit, because this is watercolour, it can be softened and blended at this stage, and there's a lot of hard-edged marks that, you know, probably a little bit too much. So I've got quite a firm brush here, and I'm just going to leave most of the marks, but just soften some of them down a little bit too much. So to do this, I've moistened the brush first. It's not wet, but it's moist. And yeah, so I'm just wetting the brush and just softening some of these edges. And this little blue mark here doesn't particularly add anything at the moment. So let's just soften that down. Right, I now need to just look at these marks up here, and I'm going to work into them with some white gouache. I'm going to block out some of the sky and some of the marks and reshape things. So I've squirted some white gouache onto my plate. I've got a separate plate from my palette so that it doesn't contaminate the watercolour. Start scrubbing this white gouache over the top of some of this so that it's not quite so big. And I'm going to actually drag some white down from the top. So people think that watercolour is a bit of a one-way process, and you know what you start with, you have to sort of end up with, but you can reshape things and cover over things and move things about when you introduce opaque medium like gouache. This dark shape here is actually going to turn into a hogweed, and I've actually got some hogweed in front of me in the studio, so I can use that as a little bit of reference. And I'm kind of stylising the drawing and the shape. So I'm just thinking of these shapes in terms of, I'm trying hard not to think of it as being hogweed or grasses or distant trees or whatever the feature is that I'm painting. It's just looking at it for its abstract kind of qualities. And one of the features that I was interested in right from the start was the idea of the triangles, the triangle effect. Can do it like that, leaving those dark gaps, or I can do it like that and scrape through. Right, I'm just picking up on some red now. I seem to be obsessing with this corner a bit, so I've got to be a bit careful. Just calming all that down a bit. I've just stood back from it just to reevaluate how it's going, and quite pleased with the way it's developing, but I just want to have another quick look through the mounts to see if it needs further cropping. Right, let's have a look at this. I could have the whole of that shape in, but it might have a slightly more abstract feel if I allow it to go off the top of the page, because this isn't a painting about a hogweed. This is a landscape. You know, this is about the field textures. So I think that might make more of a point if I crop the top, and I'm going to crop a little bit off the side as well, so that this darker mark goes off the edge of the painting. I think I'm just going to tidy up this area here a little bit, but being very careful not to lose the magic of those marks. Right, I'm going to just put a little bit more red here to continue the horizon line through there. Just blend that. And I might just splatter there, but I don't want to overdo it. So there's a kind of little bit of a suggestion going on here that there's some more plant forms, or is it something in the background? We're not quite sure, but you know, that helps keep the mystery of the whole thing. Where the gouache went on over there, it's dried with the paint shining through, so I'm actually just going to go in again and put another layer on top. because I used the black crayon underneath, that's always going to want to shine through. So, you know, that's something I'm going to accept. So I could carry on for, you know, several hours working on this picture, but I think I've said all I need to say for the purpose of the film. And so I'm just going to have one last look at it through the mounts, and then we'll move on to something different. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. For my next picture, I want to concentrate on some versions of trees. I've got a favourite place where I go and walk almost every day, and at the end of the lane there is a big bank of trees. It's very, very atmospheric. Every evening the crows fly and gather to roost in the trees, and I've very often go down there sketching. I've got a little sketch here of the whole bank of trees and lots of dark undergrowth underneath. There's a little area at the bottom where there are the two tree trunks and the sort of light shining through the gaps in the branches. And I just wanted to show you a finished painting that was my interpretation of this, which this is here. It's a very kind of wintry interpretation with lots of dark colours and kind of emphasising the light through the gaps and all this sort of stuff going on in the undergrowth. And what I like to do is repeat a subject over and over again at different times of the year. So I've also done a more autumnal version, using the same kind of reference, but just changing the colours and adding foliage and things. And I've got other drawings that I've done and different interpretations. Here we've got one with teasels. Just put that on there to show you, and show you some of the material that I would have painted this from. Different sketches, sort of silhouettes with the evening sun, and just sort of little drawings, things like this. So I've got lots of information on paper, but I've also got lots of information in my head. And that is what I'm going to sort of dig into in my studio in order to do an interpretation of a similar kind of theme to show you today. So let's get started on that and choose some colours. I've just squeezed some brown madder and some perylene maroon into my palette. I am thinking of doing a slightly autumnal themed tree painting because it's September as we film, and some of those autumn colours are starting to creep in already outside, and I'm very influenced about what's happening, you know, in the here and now. So I've also got a funny colour called Cascade Green, which does the most odd thing, as it kind of seems to change colour as it dries and goes more towards blue as it dries. I'm also going to experiment with some ink in this painting because I want to try and get some interesting granulating textures. So I'm just mixing these colours now to get started. That's brown madder. We've got Perylene maroon here, gorgeous, really such a rich colour. Mixing this paint to a sort of slightly creamy consistency because I want it to be quite rich. And then we've got this phthalo blue, which is a very bright blue. I don't necessarily think you have to be real with your colours. I try and bring an air of kind of almost fantasy into my paintings. This is the Cascade Green. It's quite an opaque colour. I'm going to begin this painting by lightly spraying the paper. What will happen is that the paint will kind of work its way into the little speckles of moisture that are there and create its own little patterns. So let's just do that. Not everywhere, just here and there. And then I'm going to just sort of start off using some very dilute brown madder, just to sort of get a little bit of warmth into the sky. Can you see what I mean about the paint finding its own way through the sprayed background? Just take a little bit of an edge off the white of the paper, leaving a little bit of the white paper and kind of using my brush in a roundy, draggy kind of way, so that it's not a solid wash. And then I'm going to put a little bit into the tree, and then I'm going to add some of this this Cascade Green, and just amazing how it separates from green into blue. It's really quite incredible. And actually, as it dries, it does go more towards the blue. I'm trying out new colours as I'm going along because it's just, I can't film, I have to paint in the way that I would paint in my studio on a normal day. I can't, paint to a formula. So this way of experimenting and almost sort of sometimes making things up as I'm going along, is very much what I do in real life. This isn't contrived or formulaic in any kind of way. So I'm using some of this Perylene maroon to put some sort of undergrowth colour. Very often on this walk that I go on, I see teasels, and in the autumn they kind of catch the light and they're just fantastic. To this, to sort of just get a bit of autumn sunshine into the situation. Keep things moving. What I do is quite often is to paint in this very loose way, and it's all actually quite messy, but then in the next stage I will take control and kind of put some meaning into some of these marks and, in a sense, tidy things up. But I hesitate to say that, because it isn't about tidying them. It isn't about making every mark into something that looks real. It's, if there's a mark in itself that's interesting, I will leave it as it is, but just tweaking it enough so that the person that's looking at it gets an idea of what it is that I saw, or what it is I'm actually trying to say in the picture. Things are drying really, really quickly. It's frustrating. Just move that a little bit. I'm just sort of left some of these, because I'm sort of conscious that I want some light to catch the edge of the tree trunks. I'm slightly worried about the way that's gone into a bit of a splodge. I'm just going to spray that to loosen it up a bit. Just do that. Right, I'm going to use some acrylic ink and kind of draw into this paint, just using the pipette, and I'm kind of doing it towards one side of the tree. I forgot to mention, I was so impatient to get started, I forgot to mention that I did do a degree of drawing before I started this picture. I just did a few pencil lines, just indicating the general shape. But if I'm doing drawing like that, it's always on the basis that I'm actually prepared to let go of the drawing. You know, some of the paint will cover up the pencil marks and I might start to lose my way. And, you know, I can hear people now at my workshop sort of saying, oh, I'm lost. And actually, that's the whole point. Because if you want to loosen up and be experimental, you have to be prepared to get lost and find your way through that and make discoveries. And it's quite hard to do that. I think letting go is the hardest thing of all. So I'm partly being influenced by the pencil lines that were there at the beginning, and I'm partly not wanting to be too influenced by those pencil lines, because a pencil line can make you tighten up. You know, once there is a bit of drawing there, there's this tendency to think, I must sort of keep within that line, because I was given a gold star at nursery school when I did. It's a really hard habit to sort of get out of. So I'm just going to dribble some water down here. Sometimes just find the end of the brush quite useful. So, of course, this is all flowing down here as well, but let's not worry about that. Let's just let it do a little bit of what it wants to do. And breaking all the pigment up. And you can get this effect using Indian ink as well. I think we're going to just let that trickle through here a little bit. Fun to watch. Fun for me to watch anyway. Right, so we have to think what's going on here. Just let that coax that down a little bit. Carry on taking the paint for a walk. We've got all these branches here that might want something. Might just see what that does. Of course, we'll have to add that elsewhere as well. We can't just have that colour in isolation. So, have that colour coming down here. I'm not so sure about that after all, so. The thing with this style of painting, you've got to be prepared to almost change your mind and adapt to the way the paint is actually working on the paper. Just get that out there. Got a nice hair here, which we don't want. And I'm now going to do a bit of scribbling. Lovely black watercolour pencil. Really hardly need to hold it at all. It will draw itself. Nice, loose, expressive kind of marks. I'm going to do some grasses and kind of undergrowth and tangled stuff, basically, teasels in the foreground. So I've just got a sharp edged scalpel here and really just slicing through this foreground. Making some nice, you can use it on the flat, you can use it on the flat like that and get stony kind of marks. Oop, didn't like that. Didn't like that bit. Right, I'm just going to put some dark to that side of the tree, I think, just to bring that out a bit. And just almost just paint with the brush end. Yeah, how about just getting a big wide brush and just painting these kind of marks. I find my hogweed sneaking into every single painting that I do in one way or another. You know, from the days of painting them in close-up, they're now coming in as things in the background. It's a great comfort to me. But I just love these shapes that they make. What you'll find if you're painting in this sort of style is that very often you'll get to a stage and you actually aren't quite sure how to proceed with it. And I find that in real life, in my real painting, as opposed to painting in front of the camera, I will get to a certain stage and then I will literally put it to one side and I will keep it propped up in my studio, and I'll take a long time deciding how to move forward with it. These riggers can be fantastic. You can just whiz around with them and create really little tiny fine lines. Isn't that lovely? There comes a time in every painting where you really do need to stop and stand back. You cannot keep thinking and making decisions every second. You just need to stand back and look at it and kind of really think, now where do I want to go now with this, and give yourself time to make the next decision before you go in and kind of overdo it. There is a tendency to want to tidy work up when you've been working in a very loose and spontaneous way. And I think you've just got to be very careful to work out which bits need to be looked at and which bits are actually lovely, interesting marks in their own way, and they can be left even though they may not be quite what the reality of the situation was. So if I've got an interesting mark or bit of paintwork, I'll always err towards keeping that as it is and trying to get the reality into the painting in a different way. Right, I've let my painting dry and had a little bit of time to just sort of decide how to proceed with it. I'm definitely going to crop a little bit off the bottom, so I will be bearing that in mind in the next stage. So let's have a look at it and see how we can take this forward. I won't be spending hours and hours on it. I'm leaving it quite sketchy because I think in a film it's just the overall feel of it that I want to get across rather than every little precise detail that I add. So I'm just playing around with my 2 bits of mount board, definitely kind of cropping some of the work off the bottom, and you know, ultimately it may even end up being, you know, close cropped quite a bit, but I would never do that until I've finished and I'm absolutely certain what's going to happen. So that's what I'm thinking. I think I need to perhaps do a little bit more texture work here and maybe just really develop the tree a little bit more than it is. It's a little bit woolly around here at the moment that I'm not quite happy with, and I also want to bring out some of this undergrowth a little bit from the foreground as well. Some of these bits here are a bit blobby and here. Very often what I do at this stage is start to work in on top with opaque paint. And you could use acrylic if you wanted, but I prefer gouache because with gouache it's not waterproof, so you can actually take it away if you want to at a later date. You can put it on and lift it off. So for example up here where I've kind of lost some of the branches, I'm actually going to go in with the white gouache and just pick out a few edges. The trick is really not to just go around your entire painting losing all the freshness of the beginning. It's so easy to do that, to just get carried away, and all of a sudden, you know, you've lost the magic. And that's what this style of painting is all about, trying to create a little bit of magic. It's not, this isn't a real world tree, it's kind of Lord of the Rings, kind of a bit of a fantasy world. It's all about trying to sort of create a little bit of mystery. I do love a bit of splatter. And again, you can do this as a nice sort of loose way of breaking areas up, getting a bit of sparkle. And I don't know what these splatters represent. I don't know whether they're little gaps between the branches or whether they're kind of that, you know, you get that kind of dazzle when sunlight shimmers through, and maybe it's that. But then when I go out into the countryside, I realise that they are there because quite often it's little insects flying around and catching the sunlight. That's what the point of this style of work is, that you can put different interpretations into the mark making. And you could spend hours doing this, just building up. I mean, I've used white gouache here, but of course you can use any different colour of gouache. It doesn't have to be white. Or you could colour the white gouache with a little bit of the colour that you've already been using. So, for example, I could add a little bit of the pinky colour that I used earlier, and I could sort of work into a few areas with that. Just break up this area here. A few little marks to just sort of loosen it up. A few little dots, seed heady, hedgerowy, insecty things. I think I'm going to leave it there with this painting. It's quite sketchy, it has a kind of unfinished look about it, but I feel that I've gone as far as I want to in terms of showing you some different techniques. I think the main thing to remember is just keeping that idea of retaining some mystery, letting the paint flow, and just not being too worried about being tidy and allowing the paint to do its own thing. The next subject that I'd like to look at is stone walls. Country walls are really fantastic subjects because they're so full of texture and there's so many exciting ways that you can interpret that. The walls can be different according to the part of the country that they're located, and in the Cotswolds here you have this sort of warm honey-coloured walls. One of the kinds of walls that I really love are the ones where they combine elements of hedge and grassy bank and wall, and particularly down in Cornwall you get that kind of wall, and sometimes they have fence posts perched on the top of the wall with bits of barbed wire and fencing, and then you've got the grasses and all sorts of things all tangled together, which gives lots of opportunities for doing some interesting paintwork. So let's just take a look at some of my reference material, and then we'll have a look at some ways of interpreting this. So I've got a drawing here of one of these Cornish walls. It's actually got sort of primroses and things studded into it, but you know, the priority really is these sort of lovely pale shapes that shine out of the surrounding area. And you know, I've just got a few marks here to sort of indicate the fact that there's lots of grasses and things sort of growing through there. I've also got another little drawing here of more of a close-up of a primrose, just to remind me of what these shapes are. I put that out. Sometimes I have lots of bits of information that may or may not be used. And I've also got a photograph of another wall. Again, this sort of intermingling of fence posts, leaves, wall, little bits of lichen here, and might sort of draw together elements from all these different things. I've also got some leaves and things on my table. I've had a little bit of a play around. I've just been playing around, experimenting with a few colours to get me started. And I may vary this when I actually get stuck into the painting, but the colours that I've chosen at the moment are a lovely one called Bloodstone Genuine, which really makes fantastic granulating speckles. That's a Daniel Smith colour. And I've got little bits of cobalt turquoise, and I've got some burnt sienna, and I think there's some cadmium yellow thrown in there as well, and a little bit of ink. So let's move on to the actual painting. Right, I've mixed up some cobalt turquoise paint, which I'm going to start off in the sky. I mean, it's very, you know, a little bit blue, so I might dull it down a bit with a hint of this colour called Bloodstone Genuine. I'm working on a rough paper this time, and slightly heavier weight, just really to, you know, show you, you know, the different kind of effects and things that you get by using a different paper. So this is Saunders Waterford again, but this time it's £300 and it's the rough surface. And I'm actually having my fence post coming, it's coming out of the top of the painting, so I'm painting it as if I'm looking up at this picture. You know, I'm down below and I'm looking up, and I'm putting this on while it's still damp, so it's going slightly fuzzy. And I've chosen a flat brush because I think that's appropriate to the subject. And it's quite nice because you've got a bit of a soft edge and a bit of a hard edge, and what I can do later on, if necessary, is just kind of tighten that up a little bit and make it a little bit more hard-edged if I feel I want it to be. I've mixed a little bit of French ultramarine and quinacridine gold, and I'm just going to start to actually get an indication of some of these rocks in the wall by kind of painting round them to start with. I do like this kind of lovely surface to this paper. So I'm just leaving the white of the paper at the moment for my rocks. Just introduce some of the turquoise again in there and just do a little bit across there. I think I want it to be slightly more autumnal than I've got this at the moment. So just add a little bit of this is Perylene Maroon, because I've got these brambles and things on my desk, and it's quite nice to actually bring that into the painting. Scumble around here, and what I want to do is kind of get the idea of twiggy, branchy stuff on the top of here. Amazing how this is dried already, because these watercolour pencils do work better when the paint is actually still wet. You get a lovely soft quality to the brush, and so I want to put some barbed wire fencing sort of here, but this is dry now, so I'm actually going to go back and sort of have a look at that later on. I'll use a little bit more of this mixture of quinacridine, magenta and French ultramarine. Do a little bit of spraying. So we got a few soft marks happening. Getting some nice raggedy edges where I've sprayed the surface, and this, you know, surface is quite rough anyway, so it's kind of almost painting, these walls are almost, they're almost painting themselves. A little bit of lemony yellow, it's cadmium, yellow, but it's got a lemony look about it, and a little bit of green gold into this area here. Right, I'm now going to go in with some more of this Bloodstone Genuine. I love that name, Bloodstone Genuine. And it just really is painting itself going even darker. So what I'm painting is the shadowy cracks really between the stones. One method that would be great for painting a wall like this would be the cling film. Again, you know, you get those lovely kind of abstracty broken textures, so that would be something that you could try. And the other method that's quite good for getting those kind of stony, granular, textures would be to introduce some sprinklings of salt. So I must try and remember to do that before it gets too dry, because the timing is everything really. With the salt, you don't want to be doing it too soon, but then it does still need to be a little bit damp. That's that. I'm also going to introduce some ink, and this one is Burnt Umber, and just kind of reinforce really what I've already done with the with that dark watercolour. Then I'm going to add some granulation medium to this, which actually some of these Daniel Smith colours just granulate quite happily without the intervention of any other mediums, but sometimes it's called granulation medium, it does help the process, and it's important that you put this in while the paint is still wet, and then you can kind of jiggle it around and move it about. And it just makes interesting textures. I'm going to add a little bit of water as well to help it on its way. I'm going to tell you the secret of this is to let it travel. So there you go. When it travels, it breaks through the pigment, leaving the speckles behind. And that's the crucial bit. And of course, when it's travelling, you're not entirely in control. Well, you're not in control. Well, you are to a certain extent. You know, you can bend the paper and you can curl it and you can, tilt it. So you do have an element of control, but you do have to be prepared to let it do its own thing a little bit. While this is still damp, I want to actually go in and break up some of these very white shapes. Not completely, but salt. Nearly forgot the salt. Let's find a bit that's still damp. The trouble with salt is it's another of these techniques where you have to leave things to dry, so you have to be patient. Right, I've let it dry, and now I'm just going to work into that top right hand corner. I feel like having a little bit more turquoise in here, so I've got this sort of almost suggestion of distant hillside or field. But I think I want a slightly darker bank in front of it, so I'm reusing some of that turquoise colour. But with a little bit of that bloodstone genuine colour thrown in, and just gently soften that into the bit below, and just have a few 3B pencil and just scratch through that, so you get nice little delicate lines coming in. You really get, yeah. So that's that. And then I actually think I want to define the top of this wall a bit. So I'm going to use a combination of some of this bloodstone colour with perhaps a little bit of warmth. Perylene Maroon. I've introduced this warmer colour because I'm kind of thinking about, you know, autumn brambles and things. I'm just going to go in with a similar colour and just do a few sort of chisely little shapes and marks. Actually just going to introduce a little bit of white gouache here, and of course it's going to flow into the bit I've just done, and just drag that down, that off. Now what I would like to do is to just get another bit of a fence post, kind of as if it's further back, a little bit in the distance, so a little bit smaller, a little bit paler. And probably what we don't want to do is to divide the painting into three, so there I was just about to do that, but it might be better to have a slightly bigger gap here and a smaller gap between those two, or a bigger gap in the middle and a smaller gap there, that kind of thing. So I think I'm going to go for this, and it's just really going to be a bit of a suggestion. Slightly wobbly, but it gives it character. I might just extend it up a bit so it's got a slightly smudgy feel to it. Oh, what I'm going to do is just wet some of this sky area so that I can put a little bit of fencing material in here with the watercolour pencil, because if you remember, it works nicely on a damp surface. Maybe something here. I've got some little bits of French ultramarine and Perylene Maroon, and I'm just going to dot them in, so we're not painting real blackberries, we're just suggesting those little dark blobs that is really all you notice in the context of all this. And I might even put a few turquoise blackberries in. Just literally because I think this area needs a bit of life relief. They're not really meant to be the actual blackberries, but they're just dots of colour to break it up. Oh, that's really interesting. It's gone all kind of speckledy. Just wondering if I've been leaning my hand on that and it's kind of resisting the brush strokes, but it's actually quite an interesting texture. Yes, I'm just reaffirming what I did earlier. I'm just leaving a few little sharp shapes which may be leaves. Right, I know what this needs. It just needs the boundary between wall and backdrop broken up, I think, with a few sort of little grasses or something. So I'm actually going to get my rigger again. And again, you can paint with the side of your palette knife, you can print little marks on, just, you know, use whatever method works. So I want these to be quite pale. I might just tint a little bit of gouache with some of the greeny colour that I've been using. And a bit too much paint on my brush. So you've got the dark lines, and now you've got these paler ones. Right, well I think I've gone as far as I want to with that painting. Quite pleased with some of the textures in the wall, and I think I've sort of got across what I was intending to, and I think that's the aim of every painting. You need to decide at the beginning, what is it I'm trying to say, and then all these methods and mediums and techniques, they're all for a purpose. They're all to try and say something in your painting. I've shown you a few interpretations of different subjects, but this film is all about experimenting, and I want to show you some other kinds of ways of starting your painting and different techniques that you can use and play around with to find your way of doing things. So I want to look at the surface that we use and see if we can find some ways of modifying it to create some quite different ways of painting. So I'm going to start, this is just a normal piece of watercolour paper, but you could use mount board or any surface you want, really. I'm using it to create an actual physical texture on the paper. So what happens is the brush strokes that the gesso makes actually show through the paintwork when you paint on it later, which you do once it's dry. What I'm also going to do is use the gesso as a kind of glue, and I'm going to stick some tissue paper onto this to create interesting textures. What you need to try and do is, can you see these little lumps that are sort of the air gaps underneath? Is just make sure that you haven't got too many of those, otherwise you're actually painting on a very vulnerable surface. And you can tease the tissue paper to a certain degree into little raised linear marks. Just put a little bit more on here. You could cover the whole painting, or you could just have it in one or two areas. So I'm just thinking about this as being a kind of random foreground to, say, a kind of mountain scene or something. Then the other thing that you could try is adding other ingredients to the gesso. And I've got some sand here, which would be great actually if you were painting an actual beach scene, to actually use some of the sand from where you're painting. But in this particular instance, I'm just really adding it as a general texture, just to add interest. So I've scattered some of that on, and then I need to add more gesso on the top because I want all the sand to be coated with the gesso. And it's really important to leave the gesso to completely dry before you go on to the next stage. Let me just get another piece of paper and just show you another way of applying it, which would be to use a palette knife and imagine a stone wall painted on a base of gesso that's been applied in this kind of way. Just to extend this idea of using gesso, it suddenly occurred to me that I could show you how you can work into a watercolour painting. So this is the piece of painting where I tried my colours out, and I'm just really using it to show you a technique. This is not supposed to be a sort of finished painting. But with the palette knife, you could go in on top of this, and it's quite thin gesso this. I'm just going to give it a bit of a stir. Because actually the paint's showing through a bit. So you can work in on top and kind of start all over again. The white won't stay white, it'll have paint put on top of it. And I'm not actually going to proceed with this as a painting. I'm really just showing it you as an idea of how you could gesso over parts of your painting that you weren't necessarily happy with and take it in a completely different direction. So, you know, watercolour is not just a one-way process. You can take it back and forward, add, subtract. You know, it's really got heaps of potential. So, you know, that's just something that you can have a bit of a play with. Okay, so I'm still waiting for my gessoed surface to dry. So I'm using a very similar one that I did earlier, using exactly the same techniques, the sand, the tissue, the gesso. That's now completely dry. So I'm now going to work on it with some paint not necessarily to make a finished painting, but just to show you how you can experiment with these ideas and choose any subject that you want to explore. I'm just going to do a bit of another kind of mountainside scene, and I've got some nice rich colour here, and I'm just putting that on, and you can see immediately how the gesso is slightly resisting the paint. The sand kind of absorbs it, and the tissue paper, you know, kind of, the paint falls into the crevices and cracks, and it's very reminiscent of a foreground in a landscape. So it's quite interesting and very, very different to the sorts of things we've looked at so far. This is brown madder. Really lovely, rich kind of colour. You see the way the paint kind of is catching those crevices and things. It's really exciting. I'm going to do a kind of sky. Just poured a bit of ink into my palette, and now I'm going to do that over the sky. And can you see how, again, oh, I love that, it's all kind of speckled and interesting. It's interesting to, you know, see how the more you work into it, the less the gesso actually resists the paint. You know, this kind of experimenting is not just something that I'm doing for the purpose of the film, it's what I actually do. You know, I think the trouble is we're all so hell-bent on getting a finished painting put to bed that we don't spend enough time experimenting. And personally, I found this kind of experimenting invaluable in, you know, helping me to learn what is actually possible with the paint. I'm just going to go in with a bit of brown here. So can you see how some really interesting textures are starting to form? I'm just letting it paint itself. I sometimes think the less I do, the better. If you just let the paint find its own way. And this is a great thing with the gesso as well. It's very, very easy to lift paint off. So you can actually lift the paint off the little raised bits and get pale bits back if that's what you want. You know, so that's a kind of beginning anyway, and kind of gives you an idea of something to play with. So let me just, this blue sky, what I was just saying about how easy the paint is to lift off the gesso. I think it's quite a thin coat of gesso, so I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work. Let's just see, yeah, it kind of sort of drags it in quite an interesting way. Look how white you can get back to. You wouldn't be able to do that quite as bright as that on a normal watercolour-y surface. let's just stop there. For my final painting, I'm going to do another tree, but this time it's going to be a different type of tree. It's a hawthorn, and I just really like the kind of windswept, slightly bedraggled appearance of hawthorn trees. They're one of my favourites. I like looking at them throughout the year in different kind of atmospheres and different seasons. And so this one's going to come out of a kind of rocky foreground. One of the key issues in this painting that I want to get over is how you can change the reality by changing the colours. So let's think a little bit about colour. So here are some of my source pictures, the information that I'll be, well, kind of putting to one side really, because I'll be working through my imagination, but at least I've got these to look at if I need them. And there are two different things here. I've got a sketch, which I feel is a much better way of encouraging you to explore and experiment and interpret, because you've already done some interpreting before you've even started, and it's kind of clear what my interest is in this particular sketch, because it's all about the light dazzling through the holes between the branches, and it's all about the kind of movement of the branches and things around the edge. The photograph is useful to have for more actual information about the way a tree grows, for example. But the reason that I've chosen this particular photograph is because of the colour, and it's all very green. And no, I'm not going to show you different ways of using green. What I'm actually going to do is change the whole colour of the painting. So although I've said that this is about colour, I've actually decided to use almost quite subdued colours. I've just been playing around, it's still wet, so I'm just going to move that out of the way and bring that in. So moving around there. So the colours I've used here are cerulean blue, which is one of my favourites. I've got some cobalt violet, I've got perylene green, and I've got some lunar black, which is a Daniel Smith colour. I'm also planning on working into it with crayons and watercolour pencils. Oh, there's a little dot of perylene maroon in there as well, because I'm kind of thinking those sort of hawthorn berries, just to sort of inject a little bit of colour into the picture. Okay, I've done the merest amount of drawing on here just to establish where I want my foreground and a few of the branches slightly off centre. And now I'm just going to wet the paper a little bit. Sometimes I find that using the brush to wet the paper is a good way to actually get your arms moving and get started without actually committing to paint. I'm going to do a bit of a combination of spraying and brushing. I'm just going to start with a bit of this cerulean. I want to try and keep some movement into this picture in the way that the my sketch had quite a lot of movement, as if it's up on the moors and it's windswept or something. And just sort of covering there's a bit of colour from my board coming through. Serendipity, I call it. Also introducing some cobalt violets into the foreground, which looks very violent at the moment. Mix some of that cobalt into it as well. Yuck, that's a bit bright. I now need to move my board down flat because I just want it to move in a different direction. So let's do that. Going to splash a bit of pink into this, and I'm going to splash some of that colour of the day. Seems to be Perylene Maroon. Just a little bit of that. Just drawing with what's called an Inktense stick, which is a kind of crayon. Just makes quite a nice, strong, rich line. I think I just want to see if I can blot out a few little light patches, and then I'm going to have to work into this with some opaque colour in order to get some of the patches of light back into it. I'm actually going to put a little bit of gouache in now while it's still wet. Sometimes the way it mixes into the watercolour creates a nice sort of misty effect. Gouache to kind of sit better in the painting. What you could do with this is you could actually mask little holes and things out with masking fluid before you begin. Okay, I think this is dry now, so I'm going to work into it in the final stage, which is to actually get a little bit more shape back into the tree. Again, sort of a little bit of negative painting in between branches. I'm just going to use a slightly smaller brush. Of another tree trunk. Hawthorn trees sort of tend to have, you know, several trunks or branches coming up from the ground. So I think we can have a few different shapes coming up there. I could carry on with this and fiddle around with it, but I think I'm probably going to leave it now. And you know, I might fiddle around and do a few more details, but nothing is going to be significantly different from how it is now. So I might just strengthen the side of that up. Oh yeah. The debate really is whether to keep this patch of pink. I don't quite know what it is, but I think if I take it away, suddenly the painting loses a little bit of interest. Let's just try, this is my favourite trick, to take a piece of paper from my trial colour experiment and place it on there, and it just goes flat. I think that's quite interesting. I might just fiddle with that edge and have a couple of grasses going through. Right, I'm leaving it. No, I really am leaving it. I hope my demonstrations have given you lots of ideas to play with and experiment with your own work. The subject of landscapes is so enormous you couldn't possibly cover everything, but at least I hope I've given you a few ideas so that you can play with and interpret the landscape where you are. The main thing is, don't be boring, experiment and have fun.